Today's Take 5. On February the 12th, we look at Charles Freer Andrews, an Anglican priest of the early 20th century who, in the height of British colonialism in India, became a teacher and an advocate and a missioner for the poor and the oppressed of India, and in particular challenged many of the racial assumptions that the British people had towards the Indian people, and was so well loved by the Indian people for this that Mohandas Gandhi, yes, the Mahatma Gandhi, called him Christ's faithful apostle for his dedicated work and love of the Indian people. Today's scripture that goes with his feast day comes out of Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 7 through 11. If there is among you anyone in need, a member of your community in any of your towns within the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your needy neighbor. You should rather open your hand, willingly lending enough to meet the need, whatever it may be. Be careful that you do not entertain a mean thought, thinking, the 7th year, the year of remission, is near, and therefore view your needy neighbor with hostility and give nothing. Your neighbor might cry to the Lord against you, and you would incur guilt. Give liberally and be ungrudging when you do so, for on this account the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all that you undertake. Since there will never cease to be some in need on the earth, I therefore command you, open your hand to the poor and needy neighbor in your land. It was one of the many passages of Scripture that spoke to the heart of Charles Freer Andrews as a young man, this passage from Deuteronomy, being aware of and opening your hand to the needy among you, and that the gospel should be focused on providing for the physical and then the spiritual needs of those in the land, that ultimately led him to enter the Church of England as a young man, growing up in what could be argued he was an agnostic or even atheist household. But he converted to the Church of England and studied at Cambridge and was ordained a priest in 1897. And while at Cambridge, he became part of what was known as the Christian Social Union, a group of like-minded clergy and laity who, first and foremost, put social justice needs of the church on the forefront. And in particular, during that time in Church of England history, that was again at the height of the British colonial involvement in India, and it was very clear to many among Andrews and his colleagues that the people of India were mistreated, if not the fact that they were denied basic human rights, but certainly the attitude of British nobility, British leadership, and even the attitudes of many of the British commoners often looked down upon and frowned upon the average Indian. And from that, in 1904, Andrews traveled to India and joined what was called the Cambridge Brotherhood in India and began to teach philosophy at St. Stephen's College in Delhi. His students and his teaching colleagues recognized his great passion and love for the Indian people, and very shortly thereafter dubbed him with the name Dina Bandhu, which meant friend of the poor, a name which stuck with him in a very favorable way for the rest of his life. During his time in India, he stood up and advocated against the mistreatment of the Indian people by colonial authorities and their puppets they had appointed in India. He was known in one occasion in 1913 to help mediate a potential cotton workers' strike that was taking place in Madras, which was basically orchestrated by colonial government influence and had the potential of turning out to be a very violent uprising, as there was essentially very little communication going on between the two sides. Andrews stood in to avoid any sort of violence to take place, but also with his talent and skill as a philosopher and a priest, he was able to help both sides understand and listen and be able to work out what was an equitable agreement. Sometime later, he traveled to South Africa and stood up and pledged support for the rights of Indian workers there, which is where he encountered for the first time a young Indian lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi. Mohandas Gandhi impressed Andrews because of his knowledge of the Christian faith and because of his desire to help all of the Indian people understand that there was indeed hope and a better life for them, and that the British government must be confronted about how to treat its citizens among its empire better than they had been doing, especially in India. Andrews' work of standing up for the rights of Indian workers and citizens in particular also took him to Fiji and other places where there were sizable Indian immigrants who had settled and begun working there. His life was one in which he became, even among his enemies who disagreed with his particular views, where he was respected because of the fact that despite the fact he could be a truth teller and he was indeed a prophet for his time, his love for all people was what ultimately was recognized in him, and the fact that that love included people who had been treated at the best as second-class citizens by many in the British Empire led many people to venerate him and respect him to this day, and he is well regarded by the churches in India to this day as one of the reasons that they are able to have autonomy but also be respected as fellow brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ. Again, another fine person for you to read up and study on more. I encourage you to continue reading about the amazing life and work of Charles Freer Andrews. Thank you for joining me. Look forward to seeing you again for our next Saint of the Day tomorrow. Take care.